Today we're going to talk a little bit about CoffeeScript. I know DHH mentioned it earlier today as one of those things that a lot of people fear. I'm hoping we can take some of that FUD away today and replace the FUD with fun. It's an awful pun, but we're going to try to do it anyway. My name is Mark Bates. I'm a consultant up in Boston. I'm the author of Distributed Programming with Ruby, which came out a few years ago. If you don't own it, you should, because it's a really out-of-date tech book, and who doesn't want one of those? I'm also the author of Programming in CoffeeScript, which is a really up-to-date tech book, and everybody should own one of those. You can get both of these available on book.markbates.com. This is available for pre-order. It is available as a rough cut on Safari today, so feel free, and it's coming out, being published in about a month's time. So before we get started with CoffeeScript, let's have a very, very brief history lesson on JavaScript itself and kind of how it came into being, because its birth is kind of interesting and explains a lot about the quirks that are the language of JavaScript. So meet Brendan. Brendan was a developer for Mozilla back in 1995, and he had a little mission. He needed to create a little language that would run inside the browser that would allow developers, and more particularly himself, to change elements on the page, interact with the user, what have you. And he decided he was going to make this really cool Lisp-style language. And he did. He wrote this really cool Lisp-style language that no one has ever seen. And the reason no one has ever seen it is this man. All right? This man came into Brendan's office one day and said, look, Java is getting really, really popular, right? So we need you to change this cool Lisp language, which no one's using anymore, into Java. We need to make it look a lot more like Java. We're going to give it a stupid name like JavaScript, so people think they're somehow related and become the bane of every developer's existence from that point on. Oh, and we need it in a week. And because those last couple requirements, it needs to look like Java, sound like Java, and we need it in a week, we end up with this. This is JavaScript. This is actually a backbone model in JavaScript. It looks very similar to Java, for those of you who've ever done Java. It's not a bad language. It's cool. It's got a little extra verboseness to it that I'm not a particularly big fan of. But it works, and it does what we need it to. We've all lived with it all these years. But times change, things move on. So if we fast forward about 15 years, we meet Jeremy. Jeremy is a developer at Document Cloud. He's also the lead developer of a little project called Backbone. For those of you just in Sarah's talk, you know what Backbone's all about. He also develops the underscore library, which is kind of like active support for JavaScript, right? And Jeremy is sick and tired of writing his Backbone models like this. He thinks there has to be a better way. And there is. So he took it into his hands, decided he would write CoffeeScript. So that same Backbone model now looks like this in CoffeeScript. Jeremy is a happy man, and now I'm a happy man. And I hope everybody here becomes happy, both men and women. So what is CoffeeScript? Right? Well, CoffeeScript is a little language that compiles down to JavaScript. That's what the website says. It's an accurate description. It's not the most interesting description, but it's accurate. It easily integrates with your current JavaScript environment, and the reason it easily integrates with the current JavaScript environment is that statement before it. It compiles down to JavaScript. So if you've thought about using CoffeeScript, thought about trying it, not sure if you're going to like it, you can try it, and if you don't like it, which you will, you can take that compiled JavaScript and just use that. There is zero loss here. Right? You're not losing anything. It's not like you say, I'm going to write my API server in Node, and if I don't like it, then fuck, I have to rewrite it in Ruby. Right? You can say, I'm going to try to write my front end in CoffeeScript, and fuck, if I don't like it, I can just use the JavaScript. Right? It's easier to read, write, maintain, refactor. These are all wonderful selling points of developers, so I'm always a bit interested why there's so much FUD around this. Right? It's a hybrid of Ruby and Python. I'm sure everybody in this room likes Ruby. I'm not sure everybody in this room likes Python, but that's okay. They only took a little bit of Python and a whole lot of Ruby to do this. And it's incredibly helpful. And I'll show what I mean by helpful over the course of these slides. So what CoffeeScript is not, it is not magic. And it can't do things that JavaScript can't already do. And the big example I always give about this is method missing. Right? Everybody in this room knows what method missing does in Ruby, I should hope. Right? It's basically how Rails works. It's the core of all of Rails is built around method missing. You can't do method missing in JavaScript. I wish you could, but you can't. So you can't do method missing in CoffeeScript. It's just impossible. It is limited by what JavaScript does. So this is what DHH was talking about. Now, he actually stole the next 2 minutes of my speech. today, and I'm kind of annoyed, but because he did it so much better than I did, this march of progress that he talked about. People say this to me all the time, well, I'm happy writing JavaScript, it's fine, it works for me, why do I need to learn another language? Right? And that's fine with me, if you really want to be that way. Personally, I think it's kind of a closed-minded opinion, a closed-minded way to go through life, and that's what DHH was talking about this morning, right? That conservative versus kind of liberal attitude towards learning new things, right? So, let's take another quick little history lesson, and again, DHH stole a little bit from me here today. Does anybody in the room know what this is? And I'll give you a hint, it's not COBOL. Do you know what it is? What is it? It's assembly, right? Okay, great. Do you know what this code actually does? No, I don't know what it does either. I stole it from a website, and I think it spits out Fibonacci numbers, but don't quote me on that. But for a while, programs were actually written like this. They're also punched into punch cards and fed into big machines to do it. And people thought this was okay. This seemed like a reasonable way to work for the longest time. And someone eventually said, that's friggin' ridiculous. So they came up with C. I'm skipping a whole generation of languages here, by the way, just to make a point. But anyways, let's just see. I'm not a C guy. I've done a little bit of C, but I can look at this and I know what's going on here. This is spitting out Fibonacci numbers. Much easier to write than this, right? We can easily write this. And this is great, and a lot of great programs are written like this today. Everybody has a phone or a computer in this room that has some code like this on their computer or on their phone or at some device in their house, right? And after a while, things went along great, and then someone said, you know, C is nice and all, it's got a lot of problems, I hate having to write header files, it's not really properly object-oriented, I can't run it on all these different devices, I have to recompile different ways. So Java was born. All right, so here's the Fibonacci sequence in Java. You know, it's a little more succinct, but Java itself is also a very verbose language, but you can write it once and run it nowhere, as the saying goes. And this is where I came into the picture. In 1998, I learned how to write Java. And I spent many, many years writing Java. Too many years writing Java. And in 2005, I was doing what most good developers do. I was drinking with some friends. And a friend of mine said, have you checked out Ruby? I said, never heard of it. What is it? And he goes, well, it's a programming language. And there's this little framework that's kind of bubbling up to surface called Rails, which looks pretty sweet. And I was like, well, you know, I know Java. I've got my JSPs, my servlets, my struts, my Hibernate, my Ant builds. I've got my IDE working. I've got hundreds of thousands of lines of XML configuration. What do I need to learn something new for? Right? It all works. It's fantastic. This is what DHH was talking. And then I looked at Ruby, and I saw this. And I was like, well, that looks nice. Damn it, what the hell was I thinking? And then I wrote my first Rails app. And it was amazing. It sucked, but it was amazing. And I was like, this really is revolutionary. I don't have to write all these XML files. I don't have to deal with build scripts. Everything just works. Of course, back then I had to deal with deploying FCGI, but you know, it kind of worked most of the time. But it was much better. It was a significant improvement. So back then, I could write an app just as well in Java as I can in Ruby. And nowadays I couldn't write an app in Java to save my life. Because I've done nothing but Ruby since 2005, but damn it if Ruby doesn't look nicer to work with. It's easier to read, it's cleaner, it's simpler, I can debug it easier, I can maintain it easier, people coming out to a project can look at it, know what it's doing easier, right? It's easier to refactor, it's just overall a general better way of being. And the same goes for CoffeeScript. It's just an evolution of what JavaScript is. It's taking Java to Ruby and JavaScript to CoffeeScript. It's just transforming the way you look at these languages. It really is wonderful. It's a new way of writing bytecode at the end of the day, right? So let's actually jump in and start looking at some CoffeeScripts. And there's going to be a lot of code over the next 30 minutes. So I will post all these slides later if you can't see all the code, but hopefully the font will be big enough and it'll work. So let's start with the syntax, which is the big thing everybody talks about with CoffeeScript. And everybody thinks the syntax is CoffeeScript. And CoffeeScript is a lot more than just syntax. But here's an example of a side-by-side comparison of the exact same code. Right? On the left over here, we have our JavaScript Ajax jQuery function, which everybody should be very well familiar with, I would imagine, in this room. And on the right, we have the exact same CoffeeScript equivalent. No semicolons, no curly braces, very few parentheses, nice white space. So the white space is evident in our JavaScript, and we'll get to that in a minute. No extra keywords like functions. Overall, it's a little simpler, a little easier to focus on. I look at this code on the right, this CoffeeScript code, and my eye is drawn immediately to the actual code and not to all the semicolons and curly braces that are surrounding my code. All right, so the syntax rules are very simple, are pretty much very simple. There's no semicolons ever, right? There's no debate in the CoffeeScript world as to whether you should have semicolons, whether you should not. There's no big long blog posts and hacker news articles and people screaming at each other. You put a semicolon in, the compiler's going to kick it out and yell at you and say, what the fuck, right? No curly braces. There's a little asterisk next to that because there are occasional times you use curly braces. But when talking about syntax and talked about defining closures and functions, curly braces are gone. No more function keyword. Don't need it. There's actually a couple other keywords that are gone. For example, the with keyword is also gone. You can't do with, which is a horrible thing to do in JavaScript anyway. There's relaxed parenthesis rules, very similar to Ruby's relaxed parenthesis rules. And it is white space significant formatting. And we will get to that in a minute. So let's look a little bit at these parentheses rules. I said they're relaxed. And on the left here, we have 3 different types of functions we're creating in CoffeeScript. And I'll talk about functions a little more detail in a few minutes. But a function in CoffeeScript is defined with the stabby arrow, the dash arrow there. So here I'm creating no arg1. It's a function that takes no arguments. No arg2 is a function that also takes no arguments. And with arg, down the bottom, takes 1 argument into the function. So when you're defining a function that has no arguments, you need no parentheses. It's as simple as that. If you're defining a function that needs arguments, it requires parentheses. Pretty simple rules when defining functions. The rules when calling functions, however, get a little messy. If you're calling a function that has no arguments, you need parentheses. If you're calling a function that has arguments, you don't need parentheses. I err on the side of parentheses. I think it's a little cleaner. I'm anti-Seattle style Ruby code, so I'm anti-Seattle style CoffeeScript code. And it saves a lot of hassle down the line because it's easy to trick the compiler into thinking you were doing something you didn't mean to do because you didn't put parentheses in, right? So if we look at this little code example, oh, that's the JavaScript in case you're wondering. Here's an example where the parentheses rules got me in trouble, right? I want to find a particular DOM element in jQuery and call the text function on it, right? If I do the first time, if I don't put the parentheses there, it's actually going to call the text function on the string as opposed to the jQuery object. Right, so in this case, the parentheses are kind of required for the order of precedence for the compiler to know what you're supposed to be doing. So if you're confused, if you're not sure what to do, just put the parentheses in. No one's going to yell at you. White space. I get the white space argument a lot for some reason, and I don't know why. People complain to me. They're like, I don't want to do significant white space. I think it's stupid. I don't understand it. And to them, I ask this question: do you write your code like this? Or like this? Because if you do, you're kind of a douchebag. And honestly, I don't want to work with you. Because this is almost impossible to read. I mean, you can read it, but god damn it, it's so hard. And and now I want to refactor it, and well, which thing is part of the block, and which one it's not, and where do these curly braces end, and I just have no idea what's going on. This is not good code. It's well-written code in that it works, but it's not well-formatted, it's not nice code. And you shouldn't do this to your fellow developers. If you're writing your code like this, take a minute, indent it properly, right? And when you do indent it properly, it's gonna look like this, and it's gonna look nicer to read, easier to manage. And then, hell, if you're gonna write this, what's wrong with this, right? This is nicely formatted code as well. So CoffeeScript is kind of trying to impose a nice development style on you too. It's trying to say, hey, be a better developer, be a nicer person in your community. Make sure you're writing your code in a nicely formatted way. And so much so, we're going to build it into the language, just like Python did. Right? And so that translates into this, just for those who are curious. I personally think CoffeeScript should have been called RubyScript, and at some point I think that probably crossed people's minds. Because it really does look and feel so much like Ruby, that to the point where I've accidentally written stuff in both languages that was incorrect. And we'll look at some of these things, right? First, kind of conditionals, right? So here's how you would do conditionals in CoffeeScript. There's no end keyword to it. We're just using the the single white space to define when that block of code is over with. We can do inline conditionals just like we can in Ruby. So do something if true and do something unless true. The unless keyword is there as well. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's just getting compiled down to a bang, that unless, if bang true, just like it does in Ruby. But it's nice to have that. It just makes your code a little more readable, I think. Objects and hashes. So here's a case where there's that asterisk on my curly braces is coming true. So here's a few ways that I can define an object in CoffeeScript, right? The first is kind of the single line one, and I need curly braces there just to delimitate that object. Or I can do the nice multi-line one, which is the second version I have here, which is the one I do pretty much all the time because I think it reads nice, it's easier to expand. And with that, you don't need curly braces and you don't need commas, right? Because it's going to use the new lines and the indentation to know what belongs in that object and where it belongs in the object. And this is great so that if you're cutting and pasting or you're adding new stuff, you don't have to worry about that extra comma at the end, or oops, I forgot to add a comma, it's the last line and I've added something underneath it, right? It's going to stop you from making those kind of very simple boneheaded mistakes that you only realize when you go back to the browser, hit refresh, and the console starts blowing up, right? You can also do if statements while building this object, right, in line. So you don't have to kind of build the object and then do an if statement below it to add something in. You can do it as part of that list as you're going down vertically here, right? And then when I'm passing an object into a function, I can do the Ruby style of not needing curly braces, right? I can just kind of pass in the key value pairs as I go. I would need curly braces if I wanted multiple sets of objects being passed in, just like in Ruby. And here's the JavaScript output that you'd expect. You see, both styles, the first two styles, both look identical at the end of the day. So it's really how you like to do it. Like I said, I like the multi-line object syntax. I think it looks really nice, really clean, saves you a lot of hassle. Ranges, we all know what ranges are in Ruby. You can do them in CoffeeScript. So on the left, you have the CoffeeScript. On the right, it's JavaScript output. Something interesting to note here, so I've got A equals a range of 1 through 5, and B is a range 1 to 5. And it builds the appropriate array for me in the JavaScript. But when I do 1 to 100, it actually does an array because it's not going to build this giant, this big giant piece of JavaScript that's going to pump in all the numbers up to 1,000 or 100 or whatever it is. And for those of you curious as to what number that crossover happens when it goes from the AB kind of style to the CD style, it's 22. I don't know why. I tested it one day.
Why not 42?
Why not 42? It's a great question. And I was like, well, maybe it's the number of characters in the code for the for loop. And I was like, no, that's a lot more than 22. I have no idea. It just boggles the mind, I guess. Someone arbitrarily picked that number. String interpolation, it's not very exciting, but it's very useful in JavaScript. It gets more interesting in a second here, and it follows the exact same rules as Ruby, where the double strings are interpolated and the single strings are literal, and the exact same syntax for doing it as well, right? Hair docs, great for building large pieces of code or text, what have you. In this case, I'm building a bunch of HTML, and I'm using the to do hair docs, you use either triple double quotes or triple single quotes to do it. And then the same style of interpolation there. So this is great. If you ever built, and everybody's done it, raise your hand if you've ever built an input tag in JavaScript. Okay, people have done it. Now raise your hand if you've ever forgot to escape the single or double quote when you went to concatenate thing. Yeah, exactly. What a pain in the ass. You don't have to do that anymore. This solves that problem. So you no longer have to do single quote, double quote, plus var name, plus double quote, single quote, et cetera, et cetera. You can just kind of build a nice little string right in there, and it saves so much time. And this gets output into this rather disgusting mess of HTML that I would never want to write, with all those escapes and the pluses and stuff like that. So functions, I said we talked a little bit about functions here. This is an example of a function in CoffeeScript. See, we're defining a variable p, we're setting it equal to this function. It's going to take an argument of name, and that dash arrow, it defines this, everything that follows after this that's indented is going to be part of my function. So here we're just going to do a console.log and log out hello RailsConf 2012. And down here, I could have omitted the parentheses when I called that function. Again, I put them in because I think for the most part they look nice, except for my console.log. I never do that for some reason. I don't know. Same thing with put s in Ruby. Never put parentheses around it. Don't know why. Here's the JavaScript output of that, so you can see what's happening. Now, when I first started using CoffeeScript, this syntax kind of messed with my mind a little bit, and I couldn't figure out, I don't know, something about it just seemed weird, and I was like, and eventually I came to this like, okay, well, the arrow is pointing at the code that's doing this for me, right? And then I realized it also seemed very familiar at the exact same time. I've seen this syntax somewhere before, and I couldn't remember where I'd seen this syntax before, and then one day it dawned on me. It's the Ruby 1.9 syntax for lambdas, just with the argument list reversed. So if you're using the syntax in Ruby 1.9, then you know how to do the syntax in CoffeeScript. Matter of fact, the Ruby version is actually more verbose than the CoffeeScript version, because you need those extra curly braces in the Ruby version, right? So give me the CoffeeScript version anytime. Default arguments, right? We love default arguments in Ruby. Everybody uses them. Rails uses them all over the place. We can now use them in CoffeeScript. So here I've got a create element function, takes a name and an optional list of attributes, and it's going to be set to an empty hash. It's pretty nice. Here's what that JavaScript ends up looking like. It's not rocket science to do that. You know, build that if attributes equals null, then set the attributes equal to an empty hash. It's not rocket science. It's just a lot of boilerplate code. Why would you want to write that when you can write this, right? Make your life better. This is all about progress and just moving on. Splats, we can do splats in CoffeeScript, right? And splats in CoffeeScript actually use a much nicer syntax. It uses the ellipsis. So you do first, second, others, or you can do first, second, etc., which just looks really nice to read in your code. And then your first and your second parameter is going to come in as expected, and the others parameter here is going to be an array containing everything that comes after those first and second arguments, just like in Ruby. And again, JavaScript doesn't do this for you by default. You have to write all of this boilerplate to make that happen, right? That's a lot of code to do that. And that is very difficult to read. You talk about bringing on new developers, and people said to me, well, I bring new developers on and they don't know CoffeeScript. How are they going to read that? A new developer should be able to read this. A new developer might not be able to read this, right? What is more daunting? You know, we'll show you this. Is this more daunting or is this more daunting? I think I know which one. The 4-line one myself, I think, is easier to read. So, loops and comprehensions, right? Moving on to some kind of fun little tricks that CoffeeScript will let you play. There's two types of loops in CoffeeScript. There's the array loop and the object loop. So in CoffeeScript, you can do for some name in some array, and then a bunch of code that gets executed underneath it. Very similar to a for loop in Ruby. And for an object, you can do for key value of some object. And then loop through, you know, the key value pairs and print them out. And if we look at the code that gets produced there, this is a very efficient for loop in JavaScript, and that's the way you're supposed to write your for loops. If you're using jQueries each or underscores for each, they're not as efficient in what they do than this. So I recommend you should use this, even if you're writing JavaScript, this style. It's a lot of work. And this is what I used to have to write in Java back in the day, and I hated every minute of it. And I'd love the each function in Ruby. And I wish CoffeeScript kind of took that same approach, but it doesn't. So anyway, loops and comprehensions. So we can do that same kind of if statement, the same loop statement on one line by putting whatever it is we want to do before the for call. This starts getting a little weird. Like, this can get a little tricky. It can be cool, but also kind of hard to read if you don't do it right. So here we're going to log out the number for the number in numbers. Word numbers there a lot. But that's the equivalent of what we had on the previous slide. So if we look at the JavaScript that gets outputted here, we're just going to loop through all the elements in the numbers and then print them out. Just so we can do it on one line. But comprehensions don't stop there. They actually let us do kind of conditionals on that same line. So here we can say only print out the number when the number is less than or equal to 3 for each number in this number. Right? So now if we ran this, we would get 1, 2, 3 printed out to the screen. And all this is doing is it's breaking down to that same for loop, this time putting a conditional in the middle of the for loop around our code. We can also capture the output of that for loop into another object. So in this case here, I want to say, for every number that's less than or equal to 3 in this array, times it by 2, shove it all into an array, and give me back that array as a variable called low numbers. All in one line of code. Right? And then I can log it out. And that gets put into this. So here, now it's looping through each one. It's created an array called underscore results to hold all this stuff. It's doing that check, that if check, to make sure it validates our condition. And if it does, it's times it by 2, putting it in that results array, and then returning that array at the very end. Again, I find this to be, I mean, I understand this, but I find this to be more daunting than just looking at this. Classes, right? Now this is where, if you went to Sarah's talk about Backbone, things start getting really nice, because you can wrap all the stuff she was talking about in really simple, easy to use classes in CoffeeScript. These 3 lines are valid CoffeeScript, the first line being a valid CoffeeScript class definition. With one line, I've created a class called employee. Then on another line, I create a new instance of that employee, and I can start setting attributes on that instance of that class, and I can create as many employee classes as I want. Now, JavaScript doesn't have proper classes. It does have the ability for us to create new instances of functions, and that's what CoffeeScript is doing for us. It's taking all that boilerplate. Remember, this is that one line of code, and it's exploded it out into 5 or 6 lines of code, because that's what you need to do in JavaScript to do that same thing, to mimic that behavior. So CoffeeScript is kind of taking care of all that for us, right? And we can add some functions on our CoffeeScript. A constructor function, which will get called every single time you initialize a new object. Here I got a salary function for a very, very well-paid developer. If there are any recruiters in the room, that is the starting number I would take. For a month, and then we go from there. But this slide actually contains one of my favorite one-character pieces of CoffeeScript. There are, in my mind, I think there's like 3 single characters you can use in CoffeeScript that make it worth it alone. And I'm going to show you the first one, first of 3, and it's on this constructor line. So this constructor is taking an optional options hash, right? Which we've already looked at the default arguments. We know what that does. But this has an @ sign in front of it. Now in Ruby, we all know what the @ sign does, right? It's an instance variable. And in CoffeeScript, it's doing the same thing. It's actually replacing the this dot syntax of JavaScript, right? So if we look at our salary function, we see we're doing @options.salary. So it's equivalent of saying this.salary, this.options.salary. But when we pass it in as part of a function call, as part of our argument list, when we say @options instead of just options, what we're actually saying to CoffeeScript is set this argument equal to this dot options. So in Ruby, we've all done this. We've said, in our initializer, it takes, an attributes hash, right? And then right below it, we'll say, @attributes equals attributes, right? This is doing that all in one character. So if we look at the JavaScript here, it's a little hard to read because I wanted to get it all on the page for you. But what it's doing is this dot options equals options unless the options is null. And if the options is null, then set it equal to an empty hash for us. Right? So this is actually doing quite a lot of work with that little bit of code. But that @ sign, when you pass it in as an argument in your argument list, is so powerful. It's the equivalent of doing this dot options equals options. Really nice way to work. There's also another thing on this slide, a little operator here, this question mark equals. Which is one of many operators that CoffeeScript gives you. I'm not going to go into operators too much here because there's just so much to talk about. But this operator here is going to say if salary does not exist, if it's undefined or it's null on the options, or sorry, if it's just null on the options hash, then set it equal to this value of $250,000. Right? And you would see that when you go and look at the slides later, you'll see it. But it's this big long line right here that's doing all of that. We can extend classes. So now we have inheritance in our JavaScript all of a sudden when we use CoffeeScript. Right? So here I've got a manager class that extends employee. Right? I've got a constructor. And in the case of constructor, I'm going to call super. And the super's got the same exact rules as Ruby does. So if I call super, it's going to pass in any arguments that are passed into that function by default. Or I can pass in my own set of arguments to that super call as well. And here in the constructor, I'm going to set the manager's salary to a default of $500,000. So now if I just did create a new manager and ran his salary, I would see $500,000. And here's what that JavaScript code looks like. The font size, by the way, if you haven't noticed, is shrinking and shrinking on these JavaScript because they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So here's a case of I'm going to override the salary. This is kind of showing that super again, where I override the salary function, and I call the super salary of, get the $500,000, and then add a 10K bonus to it. And that's what that looks like. Okay, bound functions. This is one that a lot of new developers to CoffeeScript don't quite get, but is my second favorite single character change that you can make. So I'm assuming people here have used Ajax before, right? Raise your hand if you've done Ajax calls. Okay, great. So now Ajax is loaded with callbacks, right? And how many times have you had this? You pass in something, you make an Ajax call, you pass in a callback, and you expect it to, and then you do this dot blah, 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 and you get back an undefined error. Has that happened to people before? Yes, it does. It's because JavaScript loses the scope of this, and it's a whole big thing. Read Yehuda Katz's article on it. He wrote it last summer. Fantastic, explaining the whole this context. I'm not going to get into it because you could do a 45-minute talk on this alone. And this is incredibly hard to talk about because you have to keep saying this with quotes every time you do it, so people know what the hell this is. So in this case, we've got a user class here. So this is a very simple example. User takes a name when you create a new user, and we have a say hi function that says hi to that name. Very simple. All right, so we're going to create a Bob and a Mary, and we have this log function here, and all that does is take a callback. And for those of you back in the room, it just takes a callback, and we're going to log out that we're about to execute the callback. We run the callback, and then we print out that we've executed the callback. And then finally, we pass in Bob's say hi function. We pass in Mary's say hi function. All right, now what we expect to see is about to execute callback. Hi, hello Bob, executed callback. Hello Mary, what have you. But what we actually get is hello undefined. For that same reason, JavaScript has lost the context of this. When we said hello this dot name, it doesn't know what this is anymore. It thinks this is that log function. So we gotta set it right. We gotta tell it where to go here. So keep your eye on our save function, say hi function here. All right, this is where the magic happens. This is the problem. This is the function we're having problems with. This is where we're losing our context. With one single character change, booyah, we have our context back. I'll do that one more time for those of you who didn't see it. Look at the dash arrow. It is now a hash rocket, or an equal rocket. I don't know how you want to describe it in CoffeeScript. A fat arrow is how it's actually defined. And now if we run that callback, we actually know Bob and we know Mary. To make this a little cleaner, here's that same example, just without all the log stuff going on. And here's that JavaScript output. And what we can actually see here is it's doing a bunch of fun JavaScript magic to bind the context of any function that gets passed into this underscore bind function. So when we create a new instance of a user, it's actually down here. It's redefining the say hi function on our user and passing that into and getting back a bound version through this underscore bind function. It's a little bit of magic and a little bit of craziness, but you can imagine how nice this gets when all of a sudden these context bugs start disappearing from your code. When we were looking at the backbone code that Sarah was showing, she had a line where she was binding the render function to this on that class, on her view class. And you don't need to do that anymore. Instead, when you're creating the render function, you just use a fat arrow, and that binding just happens for you automatically. So finally, one of my favorite features, this is the last of the three single character bits of code that I'm going to show you today, is the existential operator. It's all very zen, let me tell you. Right? Why are we here? Well, that's what the existential operator solves. Right? So here we have if foo question mark, right? And it's single line for them, log foo if foo, right? So what is that actually doing for us? If you look at the JavaScript output, it's actually very simple. It's checking that foo exists. It's not undefined, and if it is defined, it's not null. And then it executes what we want to do, right? This can save your ass on so many levels and makes your code so nice to kind of read and look at. And we do it all the time in Ruby with these question marks. But it gets better, right? Now I'm going to pose a question here, and I'm sure everybody has done this before. Who has used a console.log statement before in their code? Pretty much everybody. Okay. Now, Who has accidentally left a console.log statement in their code on IE? Okay, and what happens when you do that? It stops executing. It just blows up. It doesn't work anymore. CoffeeScript's got your back. You can do this. console?.log foo. And that is going to check the existence of console first and then call it. Now, don't tell me that's not worth the price of admission right there. That's why I love this. It's fantastic. I've overridden my editor, so whenever I do a console.log, it always puts a question mark in there for me. Right? And it's all it's doing is just checking the console, making sure it exists, and then calling it. It's going to solve that problem. But it gets better. It gets better than that. We can chain them together. We can do all sorts of craziness with this one question mark. So here, if there's a current user, and that current user has a first name, and that first name is not null, then print it out to the screen. We can do this all day long. We can say if current user question mark dot first name question mark dot trim isn't an empty string, then do this. Right? So now we can deal with these objects as if they might exist. And if they don't worry about it. CoffeeScript's got our back. And here's the code that it generates to do all that. It's kind of like the try function that active support offers, except I think nicer because you don't have to write try everywhere. You can put question marks. So with that said, I'm kind of winding down here a little bit. Some things I didn't cover. I didn't cover scoping, security, strict mode. CoffeeScript automatically now, when it compiles your code, compiles it with strict mode on, so you get all sorts of early debugging information and errors right then and there. It fixes common mistakes like using triple equals when you should be using triple equals when people are usually using double equals. Operators, got also great operators like that question mark equal one I showed you, the existential operator, there's more. The do keyword for when you're doing asynchronous loops. It helps keep that context right there for you. And there's more, there's a whole shitload more. And if you're interested, I'd recommend you buy my book, Programming in CoffeeScript, and follow me on Twitter, @MarkBates. And that's it. Are there any questions? Thank you.